Welcome, everybody. I am Tony Lathrop. I am the Finance Chair for the Board of Transportation, and I'm the Division 10 representative on that board. And so this topic today is near and dear to my heart. I've chaired the Finance Committee for over 7 years, and we've been grappling with the issue of escalating costs. Several years ago, the legislature passed a new law and said that our board is now fiduciaries. And I'm still getting my head around what that means, but I think I've taken it to mean that I need to talk to the CFO every week. So I do that. And consequently, we have to work on our spend plan regularly, and I see Michelle Ellis in the crowd waving her hand. She is the architect of the spend plan at DOT. Revenue forecasts all the time. The 10-year capital program, which we've just been called the STIP, which we've been working on, and taking into account cost escalations in that. And as we look at inflation to try to factor into that. And I was a member several years ago of the NC First Commission as well, which some of you or all of you may remember was a task force that Jim Trogdon set up to really look hard at the sources of revenue for infrastructure. So I'm neck deep in this stuff, and I'm in Charlotte where the growth has been exponential as well. So I've got a front row seat to construction and all of the pressures that are involved. And we're kind of a victim of our own success in North Carolina in that the growth that we're experiencing, which I think a lot of states would love to have, is driving cost escalations. So it's great that we can talk about these issues today. We've got a great panel. Before we dive into that, I want to go over a couple housekeeping points. I think you've heard in the main session, we have an app for this event sponsored by Weatherall Engineering to stay up to date on everything that's going on. So please check that out. Our moderator is Lamar Sylvester, our chief engineer. Lamar's been with us for almost 30 years at NCDOT, and he's the chief engineer over all 14 highway divisions, and he brings a wealth of experience and in construction, mobility, safety, technical services. He's worn a lot of hats, and so they serve him well. And Lamar and I do this a fair amount. We speak around the state, and so it's as easy for us. Glad to be doing this with you. Point of personal privilege, he's going to introduce the panel, but it's good for me to reconnect with Lance Simmons from Texas. And I know he's especially friends with my division engineer, Brett Knipe. So we're thrilled to have Lance here. So with that, Lamar, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lathrop, and thank you for your leadership on our Board of Transportation and the Finance Committee. Thank you all for being here with us today. We got a great panel for you, and we look forward to hearing from them. As Tony said, our industry has experienced significant and historic levels of price escalation for goods and services since COVID. I think most of us probably would have thought that it would have normalized by now, but we continue to see those prices escalate. As North Carolina's population and economy continues to grow, then we are committed to delivering the projects and the infrastructure that the communities need and that they want. But navigating through these times are often challenging to really deliver the infrastructure projects that we have. And so we're just thankful to have our panelists here with us today so that they can share some things that they have learned and dealt with in navigating the conditions that we're in today. Our first presenter is Dave Bauer. President and CEO of the American Road and Transportation Builders Association in Washington, D.C. He's been with this important organization since 1997. He has extensive knowledge of transportation policy issues, and he's a great partner for our industry. We'll next hear from Dr. Joy Badori, a professor at UNC Greensboro with their Bryan School of Business and Economics. He has served as dean of several business schools around the country. He specializes in business analytics, management, operations, and logistics. After Dr. Joy, Lance Simmons, Chief Engineer for the Texas Department of Transportation, will present. Since joining the Texas DOT in 1994, he has gained a wide range of experience in engineering. His state maintains the largest road network in the country, so they are an important leader. And our final presenter will be Yolanda Jordan, the State Administrator for the Federal Highways Administration. She began her career with North Carolina DOT, in fact. She has worked closely with the leadership of the State Division and the Office of the U.S. DOT Secretary. And since coming back to North Carolina, she's been a great partner for us. We're really excited about the panel today, and now I'll turn it over to Dave.
All right, good afternoon. When they told me I was first, I asked if I won or if I lost. And I didn't get a really good answer, but anyway. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, American Road and Transportation Builders Association represents basically all aspects of the transportation design and construction industry. State departments of transportation, county engineers, equipment manufacturers, contractors, designers, materials and service suppliers, basically everything you find on a project site is our membership. And as the name evidences, we are primarily focused on the component of the transportation construction market that comes from the federal government. And so while I will talk about as much as I can, you can take the boy out of Washington D.C., but you can't take the Washington D.C. out of the boy. So anyway, when we look at the last 3 years, as Lamar has talked about, one of the things that was in there around the same time as we saw increasing price pressure was the federal infrastructure bill in 21. And to put this in context, that for basically 23 years, federal investment in highway and public transportation followed at purchasing power levels. And for the first time in 2 decades, in 21, Congress and the occupant of the White House got behind a real increase in infrastructure investment, and boom, right along with the largest amount of inflationary pressures that the country has seen since the early 1980s. And that absolutely changed the entire conversation. And so instead of talking about what is happening with the federal investments, we're now all trying to unpack what the role of increased price pressure and supply chain challenges is having on the use of these dollars. And I'm probably not going to be able to get you a really good answer in a real-time capacity, but I'll try to give you at least some flavor for what we are seeing. Now, when we look at the market, one of the best indicators of activity are contract awards. And when you can see absolutely there was a huge spike in state and local contract awards in 22. And when we look at state budgets, which we do, every state budget, just about 70% of the projected increase in spending, that's different than contract awards. Contract awards, as you all know, are when a project is awarded. Spending is when the money goes out the door. But the spending tracked the increase of contract awards in 22 and 23, and almost all the spending that was, or 70% of the growth in spending that was identified in state budget was attributed to the federal infrastructure bill. Now, the thing to understand about that measure, at least from a highway standpoint, it was a one-year bump. I mean, a big increase in 23 in the amount of money provided to the states in 22, and then it levels off. So the federal dollars are not going to contribute to increasing growth. That happened in the first year. It takes 5 or 6 years to spend that out. The growth, calmed down in 23. Probably what we're looking at in 23 is a lot of inflation, that's reflected there. But, that, big $27 billion or $17 billion increase from 21 to 22, there is real growth in there. And it's really hard to, be able to peg that because everybody's experience is different. But one of the ways that we have been able to track that is looking at volumes. I mean, the volume of materials that is used, like in 23, in 22, the amount of asphalt volume that was used on state DOT projects was a $9 million or 9 million ton increase. And over the 2-year period of 22 to 23, there are 20 states that have had an increase in asphalt volumes of over 11%. The same period of time, 20 other states. Now, there are some states that are both, but most of them are different. 20 additional states saw an increase of 11% in cement and concrete volumes used on state DOT projects. So, look, inflation's in there. It's absolutely diluting purchasing power of everything, whether it's a state DOT, federal dollars, or you and me going to the grocery store. But at the same time, if more asphalt and more cement and concrete are being used, it's hard not to conclude that there is growth still in the marketplace. And, to get a better feel for what we saw with prices. I mean, and, I said in my opening comments that the 8% inflation in 22 was the largest that we had seen in 40 years. We had a pretty stable basket of material prices for a long time until we got into the early 21. I mean, and what the thing that you need to understand about these two lines is the light blue line is the BLS's producer price index. That is the materials prices. It's only materials. So that's largely driven by fuel, and oil and other commodities like that, but there are other things in that basket. The royal blue line is what state DOTs pay contractors for work. And the thing that the light blue line or the basket of materials does not include labor, risk, overhead costs. Every business has overhead costs. Those aren't included. And you can see for 5 quarters, the price of materials exceeded what contractors were incurring in labor costs, in risk costs, and in overhead. That's not sustainable. The subsequent 5 periods, you have seen construction costs exceed material costs. And there's a lot to unpack there, and I've already talked about a significant portion of this, and this is a point you will hear from me throughout today's discussion, so I'm not going to beat it too far into the ground right now, but risk, risk, risk. And the amount that contractors the cost that contractors have to incur, and that they will price for uncertainty is definitely part of what's happening here. And again, we'll talk more about it in a bit because I want to make sure that everybody else on the panel has ample time to talk to you. This is a breakdown of construction costs, and this is pretty standard. I mean, it hasn't changed substantially before the price spikes of 21 and up to 23. It's roughly what we have seen. Now, labor is throughout there. Throughout, the labor costs are embedded throughout all the pieces of that pie. And it's something that, and I think it's a really hard thing to understand when we look at price structures. In the last year, in general, highway and street construction wage price increase has been about 3%. And, but when you dig down into counties, and cities and counties, you get a better understanding of that variance, and that also shows up in project costs. Case in point, in North Carolina, the wage increase for highway and street construction from the summer of '23 was a 1% increase from '22. But when you look at this by a county standpoint, and Lamar, I'm going to botch the pronunciation of some of these counties, but in Alamance, Davidson, Gaston, Rutherford, and McCann counties, I get an A for effort, okay? Anyway, it was way above that 1%. And so, this is one of the challenges in talking to people about national data, because it reflects everything, and everybody's experience is different. I can guarantee you that there's a different experience going on in Texas than there is happening in Vermont right now. And, and so when and also, as I think the previous slide, which showed you the price indices show, they give you an idea, but the truth is probably somewhere in between. And, as we get further into this market and try to understand it, the variances by state, within states, are exceptionally challenging to present a definitive case, but you get enough data points and you can start to piece everything together. And I think that a great indicator of that is the role of the federal government or the federal highway funds in state budgets. For North Carolina and Texas, it's not a big portion. For North Carolina, it's about 33% of your capital spending, but in South Carolina, it's 56%. In Georgia, it's 81% of capital spending. It's different. Every state is different. And so, understanding that is important, but also, being able to talk about the environment that's happening and how those differences are manifesting in national data is useful for discussions like this, because it gives you all an understanding of what's going on elsewhere. And, and I think that as far as costs and prices, we're going to talk again in detail about that, but, this is a situation that has not gone away. They've moderated. When I talk to our contractors, they are still having, seeing unforeseen prices for things that, they didn't expect. Like case in point, last week, was telling me about, electrical, bids that were coming in for a project that were, 40% above what they were anticipating. That's if they can get it. And so that's the other aspect. We have, not only are we dealing with price escalation, but availability. And, and again, I think that is something that has to be understood and that we'll talk about in further detail. Lamar, you want me just to hand it off to Joy, or do you? Okay. Thank you.
That'll be difficult to follow, but I'll do my best. Thank you, Andrew. Well, folks, you already know from the right up there who I am. I'm a nerdy professor, and since you should never give an open microphone to a professor, because I'll keep talking for an hour and a half as if this was a lecture, I'm going to try and keep my comments at a very high, what I've been calling a macroscopic level. And I apologize in advance, but I'd rather come out and tell you right now, you might start calling me Professor Doom and Gloom when I'm done with my presentation, which is why I'm really glad some of the front seats rows are empty. Nobody can throw things at me. So, I am not optimistic that the current inflationary trends that we have seen are going to cool down anytime in the foreseeable future. And by the way, folks, the only future that matters is the foreseeable future. Okay? So, I'll tell you why I feel that way as soon as I figured out how to use this. So, when you look at inflation, let's hope this works. When you look at inflation, I'm telling you a story that all of you have seen in the United States. A sharp spike, and then it came down as the Fed raised interest rates. The spike was caused by a variety of factors, some of which I'll talk about, and some that you already know. The COVID disruptions and the immense flow of money into the economy from the government to shore up and keep us from going destitute. And then there were other factors that we will talk about. And then since then, this last squiggly bit is why I'm not very optimistic. Even the Feds don't have very good visibility into why this stubborn inflation is refusing to come down to the 2% that we were gloriously familiar with. And there is no clear indication that it will. The top economists of the country are talking about essentially the concept of a new normal over there. So inflation, I think you heard it differently. It means different things in different parts of the country. The way I say it, it affects people differently. But in the end, it's all the same. Inflation in core sectors like energy, food, is like a virus entering your body. You might think its infection is localized to one organ or two. In the end, it will spread to the entire body. So if you look at steel prices, the construction industry uses that as much as the transportation industry uses asphalt. Huge spike, followed by a little bit of decline, but it's still at a historic high. And it's going to continue that way, plain and simple. The most we can hope for is that the fluctuations will be less. And this, as you can recognize, is labor prices. In the end, if the price of wheat goes up because of the Russia-Ukraine war, it will start affecting labor prices. Plain and simple. The virus will spread to the entire body. So this is where we are. And why is it that I believe some of this is going to continue? At a global level, this, ladies and gentlemen, is our greatest national threat from a fiscal standpoint. The US federal debt. Unfortunately, in the political climate that we live in today, the discussion often gets clouded, so I'm going to eschew all the politics of it and explain to you the basic economics of why this is dangerous. But first, as you can see, beginning 2003, there has been a huge increase in spending by the government. Lots of factors went in, the spending after the Great Recession, the spending during COVID, the three major bills that have been passed to shore up manufacturing in the United States and the transition to clean energy. And this is worrisome. This is worrisome because our total federal debt, and I'm not including municipal debt and state level debt here. States don't have debt. Municipal debt here. $33 trillion, and that stands at 123% of our GDP. Our GDP is about $30 trillion. Why is this worrisome? Well, some economists or pundits will tell you, well, Greece is also at about 125%. Quite frankly, that doesn't give me much confidence if you look at the economic and the financial history of Greece. We are, and will continue to remain, the world's haven when it comes to money. And that is what has saved us. Dollar is still the world's currency, and we will continue to remain that strong. But everything has a limit. And how does it affect inflation? Well, two ways. First of all, inflation is good when you have outstanding debt because it erodes the value of the debt, thus giving the Feds and the government an ulterior motive to keep inflation slightly higher than 2%. Second, As that happens, the amount of money, the payments that the federal government has to pay out of its annual budget towards interest payments starts going up. Heaven help if the currency traders start playing monkey with our dollar. It'll go up even more. And because deficit is essentially spending, revenue minus spending, and the federal government spending is about 2/3 of it is on autopilot: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense. The total amount of spending by the government remains the same. There are no projects on initiatives in the horizon from Washington, D.C. to increase revenue because they are all unpopular measures involving tax increases. The deficits will continue to rise. If the deficit continues to rise, the government will have to issue more debt to keep financing the government itself. And there you go, ladies and gentlemen, the vicious cycle has started. This is one big reason why I do not remain optimistic in the future about inflation coming down. I do remain optimistic about our economy. Second reason, the world has become a lot more unsafe over the last 5 years, thus leading to shocks on our supply chain. You've already heard from Dave that the demand side, the increase for demand for asphalt, steel, etc., it's going to go up with the 3 bills that have been passed. On the supply side, we've been getting routine shocks from COVID to the Russia-Ukraine war that spiked up energy prices. Never forget that the initial start to our inflationary spike in our country was a rise in gasoline prices when the war started. Remember, the virus entered the body. Rising trade tensions with China. I'm not telling anything that you do not know. No matter who wins in November, tariffs are here to stay, and all studies have shown that the end product, the long-term end product of tariffs, is increased prices. Conflicts in the Middle East that have affected shipping routes through the Red Sea that carry a lot of important commodities. Tensions in the South Pacific that tend to affect our semiconductor supply chain. Semiconductors go into every equipment you can imagine, including those used in transportation. And then, and I just wanted to say, folks, if you take a look at the total amount of imports we have, first of all, it has come down substantially, but that's primarily COVID, and then the tariffs we have imposed. That pushes up inflation. And of the approximately $335 billion in imports that we have, 16%, 16% comes from China, with whom barriers are rising, and another 16.5-ish% comes from European Union. And when we did the Buy America with our bills, infrastructure bill, they, of course, wisened up and have had similar protectionist things over there. So there you go, folks. Trying to sell, trying to buy is going to become more expensive. So about 30% of this, which is a significant amount of purchasing, is subject to international global shocks. And then, of course, within our country, we have other internal uncertainties. Buy America, you've already heard about. It affects all the materials that you will be using. Steel is one of them. Crude oil is used for asphalt. Hasn't been hit yet, but who knows? Think ahead. There's great worry about climate change. In fact, the Inflation Reduction Act is nothing else but a Transition to Green Energy Act. What happens if in the near future, not at all inconceivable, Washington says you must use in your projects X% of energy that comes from, they'll tell the utility companies, that comes from renewable sources. Well, the best one we have are solar panels, and China controls 85% of the market. Can you imagine what a tariff there would do? So all these possibilities exist. And of course, there's federal and state regulations. I invite all of you to go read a report, an annual report produced by the National Association of Manufacturers on the hidden cost to manufacturers, to people in the construction industry, of all the regulations. Regulations are put in place purportedly for good reasons, to protect society, but every regulation comes with a cost, and the number of regulations is rising. So when you put all of this together, you will begin to understand why I believe that this is going to continue in the future. So I'm going to end very quickly. Andrew, am I already over my time? You're doing good. Okay, end very quickly. So what do we do? Well, there's one thing you can do. You can go out and create world peace. If you can't, or control the federal debt. If you can't, a few of us who study these things have been talking, us academics, start paying attention to lead times. Start paying attention to lead times. When you take on suppliers, it's not just cost efficiency. Start paying attention to lead times. When I'm asked a question after the session, I will expound on it further on what governments, transportation boards, etc. ought to look at from now onwards to counter the inflationary times that we will continue to live in. Thank you.
I think his time went over due to inflation. Whoops, hang on. Need to close it out. And then we got Lance. Loading. One more step. This little button should advance on the screen.
Howdy. So I'm Lance Simmons from Texas, and I'm telling you, I had the fear way back when asked to serve on this, that looking at the panel, I might be the dumbest guy on the panel. And I'm now convinced of that. So y'all just bear with me. But I will say I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk. This is a real world issue, right? And everybody in the room, I know at least in Texas, we talk about this every day. So one, I love the conference, love the fact that you guys have put a awesome topic on just to share. I'm convinced nobody's really found the solution to this yet, but it really is an industry-wide thing that together it's going to take conversations just like this to solve through. I know I've already learned lots today. But bear in mind, I'm not here today to tell everybody how Texas has solved this, and I'm not here to tell anybody how to do anything. It is a challenge in Texas, just like it is in North Carolina, and it is that relationship we have with North Carolina that has helped even what we're trying to do. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I'm just going to share already. North Carolina was already doing things better than Texas. Some of the challenges that we have, they didn't have to solve. They had solved already. And I assure you, we've stolen more stuff from North Carolina than we've shared. And Chris is looking at me already. I owe him an email on some stuff he asked me for. Chris, I hadn't forgot about you, but thanks for letting me be here today. And I am just going to share. I'm going to show one other chart here in a minute, but you do see lots of charts, and they do all mirror each other on what is happening, right? So it really is one of those things that no matter how you look at it, right, whether you look at the USDOT's calculations or FHWA's or CPI, any of those, they all mirror each other. And at least in Texas, we do our own math. Not because we're Texas, but we just like to see what our numbers on our own bid items are doing, and it pretty much shows the same thing. And it pretty much paints a not good picture for the past and even the future, but it has pointed out to a lot of problems that we've had to solve or are still trying to work through the solve, and it is something that is not gone away yet. So I will just share some good news, at least in our math. There were a couple of different periods back in at least TxDOT's history where we saw similar increases, and we did weather those. Did we ever come back to zero? No. Did the industry recover to a healthy standpoint? Yes. So I realized I got to follow Dr. Doom and Gloom. I'm not quite there yet. I do see a light at the end of the tunnel here. And I realize this may be hard to see, but this is pretty much broken out just in years if you consider the year starting in March, because we literally had some key points starting in March. So the key numbers are, back in March of 21, we started seeing a 5% increase. Not great, but survivable. March of 22 to March of 23, at least in Texas, on our bid items, that number down at the bottom is 34.7. Those were some tough times. There was lots of hard conversations going on in Texas then. And at least since then, we have tapered off to still a not very healthy 12.8, but it is better. So here's where I'm going to share why that March 22 to March 23, at least in Texas, was pretty painful for the industry is, unlike North Carolina, the Texas DOT does not have and does not use any kind of cost escalation in their contracts. So I'm going to say that again. We don't have any. What you bid, it's what you get, it's what you have to deliver. We are one of only a handful of states that do not have that, and that made it really hard for folks in 2023 trying to finish out and build a 2020 bid, right? So y'all are thinking, wow, Texas is, this guy up here is a hard nose. And I do want to explain, in TxDOT's 104-year history, 4 times we attempted to get cost escalation, price adjustment into our contracts. Our industry partners, and I'm not going to mention any name days, we'll just call them the AGC for reference sake, they weren't crazy about it at the time, but it is what it is now, but it did add to that challenge that we were going through that and are still facing now. All right, so I realize I'm going to pause just for a minute and just help everybody out. So we are indeed, here in a minute, going to have questions and answers from the audience, and I love those, and I'm looking forward to those. But in order to get folks really focused on what type of questions we want to answer, I'm going to get one question out of the way right now. So I get to speak a lot. I realize y'all may find that hard to believe. Y'all probably think, well, if I do that, I'd be much better than what I am now. But everywhere I go, folks always ask me, right, is this really the way I talk? So I'm just going to say yes. I don't really know how to change it, but I will add I have been married to the same young lady who grew up on the coast in Texas for 34 years now, and she still claims she finds it adorable. So I'm not going to change it out there at all. Only thing she says about the way I talk is she just says, hey, anything you can say, I can say slower. So y'all bear with me. I'm going to try to finish on time. All right, so what all have we been doing in Texas to try to just mitigate this? So one, we increased contractor bidding capacity. So we started seeing right off the bat a decrease in the number of average bidders in projects in Texas. And we monitor that like crazy. For the last 10 years, we had hovered right above what we consider a very healthy 5 number. So 5 bidders a project, we like. That's good competition, that is good prices, and that's good. When that spike went up, that average number of bidders decreased to right below 4. We hovered in the 3.8 range, and it got cause for concern. And in talking to some of our industry partners, that was one of the main things they were running against to, and we changed it, and it helped. Second thing we did is, and it was an internal TxDOT funding STIP thing that took a while to solve, but we got our lettings a lot more level. So at least in the state of Texas, we have a letting every month, and it's 2 days. So that's 24 days, sorry. We have letting. So for years, due to having to wait till we got the STIP approved, a lot of projects got stuck at the tail end of the fiscal year. Letting always kind of look like a hockey stick. We got that internally solved. Our lettings now are pretty well balanced. That helps contractors not have way too many jobs bid. in the month of August. And we also really went out and we now forecast our projects all the way out 4 years. And we try to put a lot of time and effort into holding those schedules to just where contractors that are bidding just have a lot more confidence in what they're looking at. And maybe you don't have to spend so much time trying to bid a job in May, knowing that there's a job right in your backyard that's coming back in June. And based on our track record of keeping that stable, you can bid with more confidence, or you can let jobs pass with more confidence. Another item we did, so we struggled during that big rise in 21 and 22 on how to a lot of times pay for overruns. So we'd have a $100 million job that would go $25 million over. We're struggling on where that $25 million is going to come from. We try to obligate just about everything, and our budget made that challenging, and we were having to answer too many times when a job overrun, not were they good bids, because once you answer that, you need to award it. But once we said, yes, these are good bids, then we had to scramble around to figure out how we were going to come up with that $25 million. So in our planning document, we created a whole new funding line. We set aside $780 million just to cover those things. So we call it a funding line for change orders and cost overruns. It has been nicknamed COCO. I wish that wouldn't have happened. I wish we could redo it, but we use COCO all the time to sprinkle on projects, and it has helped. It has made districts' life better in the fact that now they just need to evaluate the bids. If they're good, we've got that money sitting there available to do. How did we come up with $780 million? We tried to just look back in our history to see, based on what we're currently seeing in overruns, what we spent. And at least this year, that number's pretty close. We're on track to spend about $700 million of that, and we'll let $80 million with projects with whatever's left over. And that group, the districts don't get to control that. We have a group in Austin that keeps an eye on that fund, and it's worked. Another thing we did is we spent and are still spending a lot of time with our industry partners on understanding from their side of the business what inflation is doing. So typically, we haven't spent a whole lot of time getting into our contractors' business. Our contracts are with the prime, and we leave it at that, right? But learning how it affects their subs and how it affects their DBs and their suppliers and their brokers and their truckers, all of it matters, right? And we really got into all the business side of this because it really is a business for everybody, but we learned a lot on what we can do to help facilitate that. So one of the interesting things that we saw in Texas in that steep rise is we had a lot of suppliers breaking their contracts with a prime. Used to never happen, right? Somebody gives a quote for RCP pipe, they honor that through the life of the contract, and they have that 2% escalation in. Well, those pipe folks weren't honoring that when it was 34%, and it really left lots of folks in a bind. So even getting into the details between our primes and subs and their suppliers on what that contract language looks like and what we can do on ours to help that, it was a healthy conversation. We learned lots on our side. Another thing, so time. Contractor time is super critical, and even when you shorten a project, going back to what Dave says, that reduces that risk, right? It really is those prices out there in those outer years. So we've looked at ways to accelerate projects. We have looked at breaking projects up. We've added incentive disincentives. We bid a lot using A+B bidding, a lot of milestones, a lot of lane rental fees, lots of variables that we've learned that contractors find attractive. We're just using them more and more and trying to be super smart about what we're doing. Interesting thing we learned in talking to our industry is they are struggling finding folks working on Saturdays. And they'll just straight out tell you, we've worked Saturdays for 60 years, but can't find anybody to work on Saturday. And I get it, I don't like working on Saturdays, right? But it's new to the industry to where they even walked back and said, hey, 5-day work weeks are gonna work best. We try to get as many of our plans out as early as we can now. The more folks we have laying eyes on them, the more we learn, better bids we get. And the same thing when contractors ask questions, we try to answer them, give them good answers. Those just lead to better bids. And Dave said he was going to talk risk. I am too. It reduces that risk, which lowers prices. So going back to this price adjustment clause, so we polled everybody. Texas is one of 11 states that doesn't have it. And at the risk of my career, I have introduced it back again now. And it is one of those things that we are seeing a lot more folks listening. We're seeing a lot more folks supporting it. And I do indeed think we're going to be able to get it across the line now. As painful as the last 3 years are, industry partners are a lot more open to it. We think it's going to help. And at least what now our framework looks like, very similar to North Carolina's, going to be commodity specific. We're going to identify certain items in that when those indices hit certain thresholds, we're going to increase the price of that contract. We think it's going to just make the industry helpful. And I am the one banging the drum on this, and I'll just go ahead and tell you, somebody's going to say, hey, do you think this is going to save TxDOT money? And I'll tell you, no. If these provisions were in place last year, it would have cost us millions of dollars. Really would have. But it's not about saving the DOT money. It is about having a healthier industry, and a healthier industry in the long term will for sure save taxpayers money. All right, I think I'm going to stop at that. One thing, I'm going to leave it at that.
Hello, I'm Yolanda Jordan again, Federal Highway Administration. And Dave asked who drew the short straw, who won in this? I think you won, because now I'm coming behind the professor, president of ARCTA, chief engineer, so definitely you all won. The positive is, I can say ditto for a lot of the slides, or I concur, because they've gone over some things and they did it so eloquently. Also, Andrew has been looking at the time. I see him over there squirming. Don't worry, I'll be able to make up the time. This was mentioned earlier, and this is about the inflation. For us, when I did this research, I came up with about 8.5% increase over the last, from March 21 to March 22. And as Dave mentioned, it was the largest increase in 40 years. Also with this one, of course, the construction cost increase, and we saw the increase go up and down. And for the PPI, the producer price increase, we did notice about a 20% due to issues such as supply chain, COVID, and as you mentioned, the war. A lot of those things affected this, and that's what we saw, the 19.6% increase, and I just rounded it up to the 20%. Again, I can say ditto, concur with everything they've said. This looks a little jumbly, but what I was trying to illustrate is how we've had a change in different materials. So this one, in the fourth quarter of 2021, we saw concrete products, construction material, fabricated steels and metals increase from 1.2 to about 1.5%. And then the paving mixtures and the block paving mixtures, we saw a slight decrease. Okay, Build America, Buy America now applies, as was mentioned earlier, to iron and steel and construction materials. BABA potentially could apply to manufactured products, and a 29% increase in contract authority for highway funding. BABA will soon apply to all materials except cements, cement mixtures, admixtures, binders, and aggregates. What this will do will reduce competition and availability and further drive prices up until we can have more domestic manufacturers be able to produce some of these materials. As of this year, you'll see this is the list with all the material shortages. And as of this year, a lot of these materials will now have to be domestic domestic resource due to BABA. So again, we'll have the same issues with maybe prices increases because all of this BABA will apply to most of these materials. I don't know if you can see them, but if you need this, we can provide this to you. Most of you probably know, but this is something that we've been really following at Federal Highway. How is FHWA addressing these challenges? How we are trying to address these challenges? The Office of Infrastructure has encouraged all the division offices to address these unprecedented price increases for various construction materials. So we have been working with our state DOT partners, and I'm sure this is happening in every state, but we've been very diligent with trying to do that. We've been directed to work with the DOTs to determine if a reported material shortage is a basis for time extension in accordance with the contract requirements, allow non-compensable time extensions or other contract extensions to postpone non-critical paving work until such time that the material is no longer short supply, switch material types to maintain to material that meets design criteria and is readily available, and at a last resort, contract termination and deferral of the work to another year. This cost and supply of asphalt, this is what we have done more nationwide. North Carolina Division has assisted NCDOT, CUU with opt-in steel price escalation clause. And I'm looking at Chris to make sure I'm not saying anything wrong. He's not saying I'm not, so, or Lamar, so hopefully we saying that correctly. Price escalation clauses. I have one part highlighted because I just want to make sure everybody understands that. The cost and supply asphalt, cement, and fuel have historically been volatile enough that are commonly covered by the states with commodity price escalation clauses. By federal appropriation law, FHWA cannot participate in retroactive price adjustments in the original contract if the original contract did not contain a commodity price escalation clause. And that's something I want to make sure we highlight. I shared these presentation with everybody in our office, with the people in my office, and they want to make sure we highlight that part, that we cannot do it unless it's in that we can't do it retroactively. There have been 2 steel requests with North Carolina DOT, 1 Portland cement request since 2000. Our position has been to participate in the escalation clauses if it is in the contract prior to bidding. North Carolina DOT price escalation clauses are fuel, asphalt, cement, and steel in traditional contracts. IDID contracts just based on the CPI. NCDOT did not pay retroactively some price increase using state funds when we had COVID supply chain issues. Also, adjustment clause should be an index which reflects highway material price increases but is not susceptible to manipulation. How can we help? We can bring in FHW Resource Center for technical assistance and training. We have done that before, and we're trying to do that so that we can help out with that. The North Carolina Division will continue to coordinate with NCDOT to ensure the appropriate use of price adjustment clauses on future contract, and we'll work together to promote development efforts to help mitigate labor shortages. So mitigating our labor shortages, we have OJT-SS, which is our on-the-job training supportive services. We use those funds to help with any training that NCDOT may need to help with their labor, labor shortages. So we're hoping we can help with that. We're also providing that training whenever we find a need. We receive that funding every year. We receive a large amount of funding, so we're working with DOT to help with that training when it's needed. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our panelists for their very insightful and the great presentations that they did. And so we'll go ahead and jump right into some of the discussions. And Dave, I'll just start with you because you mentioned risk. And so what are the things that contractors are having to consider as they bid new multi-year projects in the current environment that we have?
Works. Yeah, I mean, as I said in my remarks, you know, the two big components that are most obvious are material prices and availability. You can't separate that. I mean, just because you can buy it doesn't mean you can get it. I mean, and that has to do with labor also. I mean, you know, it's going to cost more to get labor, and can you get labor? I mean, and you know, and I think one of the things that in talking to our members is hard to forget, or is hard to keep in mind, and that is this is a national workforce shortage. I mean, we came out of the pandemic, and a lot of our fellow citizens changed their lives. They decided, I'm not going to work, or I want remote work. You can't do remote work and do highway construction. Well, you can if it's in the office, but for the most part, you know, you need bodies at a work zone. I mean, and so, you know, you're gonna have to pay more, and then there's the question of can you get it, and those are for materials and labor. And I think the other thing that needs to be understood is, you know, contractors are having to think about regulations. I mean, we have a lot of new federal regulations. Yolanda talked about Buy America. I mean, and look, I mean, the funny thing is, whether you notice it or not, I mean, and I did because it's my job, but when President Biden gave his State of the Union address in '23, there weren't a whole lot of bipartisan applause lines, and there might have only been one, and I guarantee you that one of them was Buy America. They all wanted it. They all want, Republicans, Democrats, they all wanted expansion of Buy America. It sounds great, and we're for it. Our members are manufacturers as well as other things, but it's also one of those deals that it sounds good, but it's hard to do. And, you know, and so I think that is something that contractors have to consider. And, you know, certainly when they look at regulations, a state DOT that is willing, or an owner, not just a state DOT, an owner that is willing to have a dialogue about navigating things is way more productive and is not going to have as much of a challenge as somebody who says, that's your problem, go figure it out.
Great, thank you for that. Joy, you talked a lot about the economy and how that the things that are going on around the world and here domestically, but wanted to maybe see if you can focus in a little bit on North Carolina and maybe tell us what the economic outlook for North Carolina looks like for the next year or two, and what does it mean for contractors, both big and small?
Thank you. Thank you, Lamar. Having delivered some doom and gloom in my other talk, let me tell you that I'm cautiously very optimistic about North Carolina. In general, if you look at the past, North Carolina's economy has hovered, and I use the word hovered, just a little up or a little down with regards to the national economy. So looking forward, say for the next year or two, what we expect to see is inflation, including in construction, coming down and starting to exhibit what we call a random walk around a high level. First and foremost, folks, I hope we all understand that we've got to set our expectations from the past in the past. Tomorrow ain't gonna look like yesterday. Yesterday is gone, and nor will day after tomorrow bring us back yesterdays. So in this new normal, in the new future, I expect inflation to come down and start hovering around, my best guess is somewhere in the 3 to 4% range, which is still higher. And I'll tell you what, the only thing I see, what we can do about it. The labor market, which is a significant source of upwards inflationary pressures, because as you've heard, and as you know, it's very hard to find labor. It will ease off a little bit because consumer spending is expected to decline a little bit as the last of pandemic era surpluses go out of the wallets of consumers. But the larger sense among economists is don't expect the labor market to suddenly open up and have a lot of abundant labor, because companies have the recency of that bad experience coming out of COVID, and they would rather hoard labor in the short term. But overall, it will look good. The price of construction materials, steel is one thing that I worry about. It's used by the construction industry more than in the transportation sector. I worry about it a lot because of tariffs and what's going to happen about the eventual acquisition or merger of US Steel. When it comes to asphalt, I don't think prices are going to come down simply because the demand is so high. But at least on the good side, I believe crude oil prices will remain stable. So overall, it feels good. And you know what really helps us the most in North Carolina is, and I'm not trying to, as a state employee, not trying to butter up to the politicians, but over the years, regardless of what party has been in power in Raleigh, we've had a very pragmatic government. And overall, a very business-friendly government that does not shoot from the hip in passing new regulations without thinking through things or start lawsuits against companies based on culture issues. That's going to really, really work in our favor. So overall, I'm very, quite cautiously optimistic about us. What do we do? And I briefly touched upon it in the last line, and I'll tell you, as contractors, what the only piece of advice I can give, because most of the sources of this inflation and uncertainty are outside our control. But there is one thing that you could control, not to eliminate it, but minimize it. And that is what I call time efficiency. All along in setting up projects, we have been obsessively focused on cost efficiency. How do you cut down costs? Now, the same kind of thinking must go into deciding how do we cut down on times of various processes. Because while time was always money, now in an inflationary environment, time is a heck of a lot of money. And length in time increases risk, and that introduces cost escalations. So to give you a silly example, you can't do anything about the time that it takes to mix concrete or for the concrete to set. But you can do one heck of a lot about the transportation of materials, about paperwork, processes. Same thing for governments. If regulations are to be obeyed, if there are things to be done, not only should governments hand out contracts with time efficiency in mind, but also make sure that the time it takes to get approvals is cut down as much as possible. So I will leave that concept with all of you. Let's start thinking about time the same way we've been habituated to think about cost.
Thank you, Joy. I think at least I can probably speak for all of us as an industry that we're thankful to be here living and working in North Carolina, where the economy has been strong and continues to be that way. I'd like to turn it back over to our board member so he can talk a little bit about what his understanding of some of this topic.
I just want to ask you all a couple quick questions. A lot of you may know we've been working on the next iteration of our 10-year capital program. We call it the STIP. And in our finance group and ultimately to the full board, we spent a good amount of time over the last couple months coming up with our inflation rate to factor into this 10-year program. And previously, for the first 5 years, we had used a 3% rate. And this time, after a lot of, and I want to give a quick shout out for a really good process, because Lee Wing and David Wasserman and Kristen Barnes, who helped us run this process to come up with our interest rate, did a super job. And so when it came time to vote on it, we had a really good consensus. But we chose 5% for the first 5 years of this 10-year program. And then after that, for the 5 out years, which are kind of softer anyway, a flat dollar amount, but the 5% compounded. So I want to ask you all, the group, and I don't have time for all of you to respond, but maybe one or two of you. Do y'all have some key takeaways for us here in NC with regard to stabilizing costs and delivering projects? Because we had to take into account delivery rates as well in that. So in this kind of environment, can you all share anything with us on that? Lance?
Yeah, be glad to take this one. So heard lots of good comments today. I'm not going to dwell too much on the risk, but I am convinced, as Dave said, right? So there is a price for uncertainty, right? So anything we can do, minimize that risk, reduce that risk, eliminate that risk, is really going to help. Time, also super important. We really are in Texas right now, chopping up lots of pretty big projects to make them more manageable. So instead of having a 4-year job, we're going to have 2 2-year jobs. And it really does shorten that to where somebody's not having to guess what the price of diesel is going to be in year 4. And that is even something we heard back from industry. And even it makes that availability issue that Dave talked about even better, where now you're only trying to procure half the materials. We are encouraging and use material on hand as much as we can. From individual meetings, especially with a lot of contractors and DBEs, that is super helpful. That lets them buy all of their material right at hand. We'll even store it for them, right? We'll make our yards available to get that, and that just locks that price in. The material sets right there, and you don't have to worry about a supplier breaking that contract or changing that price. We work hard to put as many options in our plans as we can. That gives the contractor more people to choose from. Just about every bridge we have now, we're looking at drilled shafts and driven pile. If the soil will take both, we're putting it in. A lot of variabilities now out there in the electrical world, pipe, PVC, anything we can do, we're adding options in and just giving more choices. And we're working hard really not to sole source anything. That really is a painful process, gives lots of control. And I think I'll stop there.
Great. Let me also ask you all, in the same vein, advice to us at NCDOT about how we can help mitigate risk for our contractors when they're bidding, as they, they're factoring things into their bids. You want to take that?
Thoughts on that? I think that it's already been alluded to briefly, but really, I think what you all demonstrated,
Not here.
Texas demonstrated with regard to price adjustment clauses and sort of the flexibility to have a dialogue is key on a lot of different things. I mean, we had contractors in a lot of other states whose owners didn't believe prices were increasing in 22. I mean, and the fact that you all are willing to have a dialogue and have a discussion about that, and talk about a path forward has benefits to a lot of different applications. I mean, and then a more micro observation, with one of the, every conversation that we have, as I guess sort of in keeping with what Joy mentioned about focusing on what you control and what you can't control. Like, Buy America is one of the things that everybody's going to have to deal with, and and it comes up in every one of our meetings. And most of our contractors have been super envious of what Florida did. I mean, they have developed a list of pre-approved or compliant products. So, when the contractor looks at bidding a project, they know what products are going to be Buy America compliant for working on that. And, that eliminates risks, eliminates uncertainty, and, most of our members have, been super excited that at least somebody stepped up and showed that that can be done.
Tony, if you don't,
Yes, sir.
so I'll just add on something real quick. So when you ask advice, I'll give the same advice, give the folks in Texas too, that we hadn't really touched on. So in Texas, we just call them clean projects, right? Projects, you've got all the right-of-way already in hand, utilities are moved, you've got your environmental permits already done, and the railroads even signed off on everything. Pretty much turns the contractor loose. But any of those that aren't done when that project lets, those are all risk. Yeah, eliminating those, just, we think's really wise.
Great. Lamar?
Before we open it up to the audience for a question, Yolanda, I would like to go to you to see, from the federal standpoint, federal highways, are there some innovative strategies you are seeing across the country for addressing our construction cost increases that we're seeing?
Yeah, I will say the ability to have an early work package is one of the attractions of the Progressive Design, Build, and Construction Manager General Contractor, CMGC, and you all did that with the Alligator River project. So that is one. And then also our SEP 14, if we can just work with you on that, the SEP 14 process is one that you can use to use some type of innovative tools with that.
Okay, great, good. So we do have a few minutes that we would like to open it up. If anybody in the audience has a question, we've got a microphone that we'll be glad to bring to you.
Lance, just a quick follow-up to something you said earlier about breaking projects up, because we've looked at that pretty hard, especially in some of the larger ones. If you split let's say it's a 20-mile project, and you split it in half or whatever's close to half, are y'all seeing the cost be somewhat similar, or are you paying a premium for having two different contractors out there? And how are you handling your inspection? And are you driving cost up at all by splitting it up?
So, Chris, I'll tell you, yes. So especially if that job is progressed already in the design phase, yes, there is a cost to sit there and then now develop two different sets of plans. Typically on the inspection, we'll either have the same area office inspected all at once or the same consultant inspected all at once. We have, Chris, studied enough metrics to where we are saving money on those construction costs. And I'm convinced it really is not having a year 3 or 4 in the bidding process. It's 2-year ones and 2-year twos. Yeah, we do think you total it all up, it is worth the effort to save it.
Councilmember Rao, Town of Morrisville in Wake County. I just want to thank you all for a great presentation. First of all, DOT, the STIP program really worked well for us in Wake County. Out of the $800 million allocated to Wake County, we got about $300 million in approved construction when McCrory was the governor. And lots of projects getting done, a lot of partnerships with some of our projects. But I guess my question is, particularly the McCrimmon bypass. I guess my question is, we're continuing, not only in Morrisville, but around our area of Wake, and I'm sure it's around the state, delays of projects. So is it just a mix of these factors you talked about today with BABA and the material costs going up, labor, and I guess it's just concerning to a lot of us because we want this to work and we realize that there's limited resources. So I like what Tony said about the final thing is factoring in the 5% and then going down over that when we get to the 5-year horizon. But what can I take back to City Hall with any kind of optimistic message to my colleagues?
Lance, from a state perspective, can you maybe just address delivery and how you keep delivery schedules going during a time like this?
Yeah. So delivery is a challenge on our staff and our consultant staff. Our program really has not ever been bigger. We're doing it with fewer employees than we were when our program was about half the size 8 years ago. We rely a ton on our consultant world, even from a design and a CEI, but we also rely on a lot of our local partners with city and counties. So one thing Texas is blessed right now is with funding. It is not uncommon for a city or a county in the state of Texas to bring us a complete, clean project, 100% designed, all the utilities moved, all the right-of-way done, and that is super helpful. And you'd be amazed how quick those can go to the top of the funding line when they're ready to go out the door. We've also tried to solve a few problems. So as our funding has increased, a lot of our local cities and counties hasn't necessarily, right? Our funding comes from state sources that don't really go to cities and counties. So what we done, we had a couple of different initiatives where we went through and looked in a normal project development when we were cost sharing with the city or county, what we were required by law to have and what were just a text dot rule, and we found 2 text dot rules. So for whatever reason, 50 years ago, somebody decided that on any right-of-way, we needed 10% from the county. That got expensive for counties in a hurry, and it was really slowing our project delivery down. We had it ready. We're sitting there waiting on a check from a county judge, and we've learned we could change that 10 to 0. It was in our own rules, and we did. 1, it sped project delivery up. 2, made us super good friends with lots of counties that don't have to pay anything now. And we did the same thing on our off-system bridge program. That requirement, we learned, was not a federal requirement, and with the IIJA having all kinds of money additional for bridges, we applied that to the local match, and yeah, move on. Hope that answered the question. That was a long answer. I'm not even sure if that was the right question.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and great partnerships, like you said, working with the municipalities, bringing some partnerships that can really help move projects and get them delivered. I think there was one more question, saw one more hand.
Jeff Mosier with Ferrovial Construction. ASCE published an article a few months ago in their monthly publication. That article was about using heat maps and materials to source materials specific to a region for a project. Have you guys looked at using heat maps in efforts to change the specifications for a project that would benefit using something that's more cost effective to a certain region?
Lamar, I'm gonna take this one too.
Okay,
Beth.
you can take that.
So we didn't call it a heat map. We called it a local availability source map. But we did indeed try to make all pavement designs as local as possible. So we run into all kinds of issues. Mostly, so it started with flex base, that we really did run into some issues of what we had specified and had worked with us tried and true. We were running into availability shortages there, and when you run into availability shortages, the price just goes up, right? So rather than having 10 inches of something that's worked for us forever, we spent time going local, and if you can get 12 of something local cheaper than you can get 10, and you get the same strength, yeah, we're making it happen in Texas now.
Yeah, I think as Lance talked about earlier in his presentation, having competition on your bids and things like that really helps the industry and helps us to get good prices for those products. And I know at NCDOT we do know where our materials are coming from, our asphalt plants, our concrete plants, and where those materials are coming from. And we do look to make sure as we're looking at projects, looking at the availability of materials in the regions that we're putting those projects out in, because we know that it affects the cost that we'll get on those projects. So I think we can take one more question. Andrew, right in front of you. This way, behind you now. There you go.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this. This has been enlightening. Lighting designer, so enlightening. We are on the technical side of things, and I wonder what your thoughts are on the impact of the R&D tax credit legislation and the lack of walkback. I'll leave it there. I mean, I'm just curious.
There, Dave. Yeah,
I mean, this is going to be a broad answer to your question, but I mean, just like the last question, you know, I don't think people appreciate the level of technology and innovation that goes on in this industry. I mean, and you know, I remember a couple of years ago, or probably 5 or 10 years ago, when a handful of our companies were using drones. I mean, and now everybody has it. And on and on, and you know, and certainly, you know, our and scale. You know, smaller companies aren't going to have huge R&D budgets, but a lot of our members, especially on the manufacturing and the design side, and some of our national firms, absolutely, you know, that is a core component of their future growth plans. And we talk about it all the time, and you know, and that's something that, you know, you can't just say more money for roads and bridges without saying more money for also how do we do it better. And you know, and I think that, you know, once you stop growing, you stop, you know, or once you stop evolving, you stop growing. I mean, and that's exactly the purpose of that tax credit and why I think it's so broadly supported. Now, finding the money, and that, you know, whenever we get into a Washington conversation, I mean, it's like, how are you going to pay? Where's the money come from, and all that? I mean, but the merit doesn't necessarily need a whole lot of convincing.
Great questions. Thank you all. I want to thank the panel for their great knowledge that they've given us here. A lot of super info, a lot of good practical advice as well. I want to thank Lamar for moderating. Great job. I want to thank all of you all for being here. I mean, we've got almost a full room here, and I think it's testament to the importance of this, and so we appreciate you all being here. And we've got a break here, so we will all be around, and I think the panel will be here too to visit with you all if you want to talk some more about these or you've got questions. After this break, our next session in the general session starts at 3:30. And then also be sure to go by the exhibit hall and check in with all of our exhibitors that have taken the time to come here. So with that, I want to give our panel a round of applause, and thank you. All right, we're done, and you've got a couple extra minutes.